Our next to last concept here is 53.5. It says that many factors that regulate population growth are density dependent. So we talked about the fact that exponential growth is not usually what we see in the real world out there in nature. We want to ask why. Why do some populations go through this big exponential growth for short periods of time, and then how come that can't just continue indefinitely? What are the different things that affect the population size? So there's two general questions about the regulation of population growth. First, what are the environmental factors that stop a population from growing indefinitely? How come we don't see that exponential growth throughout the natural world very often? And then why do some populations show radical fluctuations in size over time while others remain fairly stable? So the question is, if E. coli can reproduce every 20 or 30 minutes, why isn't the earth covered miles deep in E. coli bacteria? What has kept that population in check, and what has kept it down to a manageable level? When we look at these factors, we can talk about population change and population density, and we can ask, is it something that's density independent or something that's density dependent? In density independent populations, the birth rate and death rate do not change with population density. In other words, the number of creatures packed into the small amount of space doesn't really affect the birth rate and death rate. That's not generally what we see out in the natural world, although there can be some examples. In density dependent populations, birth rates fall and death rates rise with population density, and that of course means you're probably getting closer to the carrying capacity for that particular land. A good example, or I guess an analogy of density independent would be, say for example, whether or not houses that are built along the seashore get destroyed by a hurricane. It doesn't matter if you have one house every mile along the seashore or you have 50 houses every mile along the seashore. That doesn't affect the rate at which houses get clobbered by hurricanes. It doesn't affect the possibility or the possibility of the house getting leveled by a hurricane. So that's population or density independent. So that's a good kind of analogy. It doesn't have to do with the density of the population. It's totally something else that determines that. In density dependent populations, that's normally what we see out there in nature, because you start to reach carrying capacity, and as the population density increases, you start to have fewer births and more deaths. That's usually what we see. Here's a chart that kind of shows that. So in the red, we have the density independent. So the density independent death rate here, you see it doesn't really matter if as the population density changes, it tends to stay the same. The difference here with the density dependent, the one in the blue, is as the population density increases, the birth rate drops and the death rate goes up. So you have this equilibrium point in the middle. The blue one is the density dependent one, and it changes based on the population density. You notice the independent one doesn't change depending on density. We're going to focus on the density dependent population regulation because that's normally what you see out there in the world of biology. Density dependent birth and death rates are an example of negative feedback. Remember when we were talking about homeostasis, we talked about this idea of negative feedback as it applied to, say, the human body or a particular organ system. But this same idea can also be applied to entire populations. And so the greater the density, that starts to provide a negative feedback on the birth rate of that population. Density dependent birth and death rates are affected by lots of different factors, lots of different environmental factors: competition for resources, territoriality, diseases, predation, toxic waste, intrinsic factors. We're going to take a look at just a few of these briefly. There's also a good set of pictures and explanation on page 1183 and 1184 of your textbook. Here's a good chart showing density dependent population growth. As the population size increases, the rate of births starts to drop. So this is the normal example, or the normal curve that we would expect to see in population density dependent growth rates. You can relate this chart back if we were to look at that sigmoid curve of the growth rate that we talked about, the particular type of growth rate that slows down. As this is dropping, that is related to, say, the slowing of that rise of that S-curve that we looked at previously. One of the factors that affects this density-dependent birth rate and the slowing of the birth rate, the raising of the death rate, is of course competition for resources. In crowded populations, you have a greater intensity of fighting and competition for resources, and that's going to result in a lower birth rate. Here you have the wheat field that is very highly populated, very dense in population, and the reason we add fertilizer to our wheat fields is so that we can have them thrive at such a high population density. In the natural world, if we didn't add fertilizer and irrigate and do all the things that we do on a farm, there's no way the wheat field could be this densely populated. The competition would be too great, and a lot of these plants would be basically outcompeted, and they would die off, and the reproduction, the creation of these little wheat kernels that make our bread and flour, wouldn't be as high. So the only way we can keep this type of population density and this level of density up is by augmenting the resources, by adding water, adding fertilizer, giving them as much as we can give them to reduce competition. Another thing that happens is the buildup of toxic waste, the accumulation of toxic waste. Think about like a city like New York City, and one of the major problems of a large urban area like that is dealing with all the waste product that humans create, that all these living creatures are producing on a massive amount every day. So that also plays into account for all living creatures. The accumulation of toxic waste can contribute to this density dependent regulation of population size. The example they give in the textbook is with brewer's yeast, which is used to make bread and wine and that type of thing. Well, if you're using brewer's yeast to make wine, the brewer's yeast take carbohydrates, and through the process of metabolism they create ethanol, which is the alcohol that you find in wine that you drink. But that ethanol is actually a toxic, a toxin, a poison to these little guys. So as the population size grows and becomes more dense, more ethanol is produced, and that actually begins to limit their ability to survive. Of course, another major factor is predation. As prey population builds up, predators may start to feed preferentially on that species because there's more of them and they're easier to get. In your textbook it shows these trout and these particular mayflies or insects. The trout may not eat normally a huge number of mayflies, but during the breeding season, to where they are so common and so easy to get, suddenly the trout may find that these are the guys that they're going to fill their bellies on. So predation may change as population density rises. It may become easier to capture and eat these guys, and so the trout will start to prefer this particular population, and of course that's going to decrease the number. For some particular populations there are various intrinsic internal physiological factors that seem to regulate population size. Even if they have seemingly enough space and enough food and not too many predators, there seem to be internal factors such as aggression and hormonal changes that affect the population growth. In this particular example of white-footed mice, when the population size increases and the density of the population increases, they begin to breed less and they become sort of more aggressive with each other, and they're less likely to reproduce. And that seems to be an internal sort of physiological response. Even if they have enough food and enough nesting space, they tend to go through this process. Another trait or factor that we would have to take into account is territoriality. Well, that's a tough word to say. Territoriality. Lots of species, particular vertebrates, large animals, and some invertebrates even, they compete for territory. They like to have a certain amount of space because they need a certain amount of space to raise their young and to provide a large enough carrying capacity for them, to provide enough food and shelter and that type of thing. So a lot of them tend to try to protect a certain territory to keep their space, and so that limits the density because there has to be enough space for enough of them. And you see this often in like birds, particularly when birds come in large masses to nest at a particular island, or like the penguins that we saw earlier in the chapter. They have to have a certain amount of space, and they want, say, 2 feet around them or 3 feet around them. And if they can't get that 3 feet, they're not going to be happy, and they're going to look elsewhere, or they may not even make a nest and lay eggs. So the amount of land available is going to limit the population density. Here you see a cheetah marking its territory by urinating on the tree or the log, again showing and telling other cheetahs, hey, this is my space, keep out of here. That's going to limit the population density because there's only going to be so many square miles of space before they run into man and other predators and lack of food and things like that. Finally, one last factor that can affect population density is disease. Most diseases tend to strike the higher the population density. They are more easily passed through a group when the population density is higher. So when you make it easier for pathogens to spread, you're going to make it easier to have more creatures get sick and possibly die, and that's going to lower the population density itself. This even occurs in humans. When there are outbreaks of various diseases, whether it's the flu or SARS or tuberculosis or even just the common cold, if you live in a high population density area, you're more likely to be infected. That's why, as a teacher, especially if you teach middle school or elementary school, it's virtually impossible to get through the year without getting sick, because you are in contact with hundreds and hundreds of students who are themselves in contact with hundreds and hundreds of other students. Such a high population density pretty much ensures that the latest round of cold or flu is going to get passed between those creatures. Alright, we're going to take a quick break right there. So that answers our first question about the regulation of population growth. What environmental factors stop a population from growing indefinitely? And like we said, that could be everything from competition for resources, to predation, to toxic waste, to territoriality, to disease. Lots of different factors keep populations in check. Our next question is, why do some populations show such radical fluctuations up and down in size over time, while others tend to remain stable? We're going to come back and we'll tackle that question next.